Hello and welcome to our monthly Window On program, which is our monthly virtual panel by the Conference Board on hot topics in economy, policy and all related. My name is Bart van Ark and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and I'm again proud to be able to moderate this panel with again a number of great speakers that we will be able to listen to today and with whom we will be able to share your thoughts, your questions and your ideas on important real-time topics. This is our fourth panel focusing on COVID-19 crisis. In February, we talked about the implications of what at that time still was largely a crisis in China, with some spreading around Asia. In March, when we were in the midst of the global pandemic storm, we looked at all sorts of perspectives in one webcast, at the medical, the economy, the business and the policy parts. And then last month, we spoke with various experts about the reopening of the economy, again, things that are happening right now. And in today's Window On, we will be looking at, again, what's ahead, but now we're really going to focus a little bit more on, our regular business processes. And one of those business processes is innovation. And how do you innovate in times of crisis? And how do you prepare yourself to get stronger and fitter out of this crisis to prepare for the next phase of growth? Before I introduce these topics a little further, and before I introduce my panel, I just want to remind the audience that some of you are eligible to CPE credits. Those credits you can get, but you will then have to type in your full name and email address in the space provided. You have to click OK for free pop-ups that occur during the program. You have to stay online for the entire webcast, and the credit is only available for participation in the live webcast only. And the only other thing that I would reiterate again is that we'd like to hear your questions. We have many people on this call, so we'll probably have more questions than we can deal with. However, we can get a good idea of your questions and comments. And we will weave them into the conversation as much as we can, and our panelists will also be looking at these kind of issues. So let's go back to the topic that we're going to talk about today. Talking about innovation, quite often what you hear these days is, every crisis provides or creates its opportunities. And that is something that is certainly true. And even though we're still in the depth of what could very well be one of the worst crises since World War II, it is important for businesses to grasp not only today's challenges, but also to be beginning to think about what are the opportunities for recovery and growth coming out of the crisis. In other words, we need to work ourselves a way out of the crisis. We need to manage the needs of the present. We need to include innovation projects that have been worked on for a long time. And we need to take the necessary steps to focus on the innovation agenda for the future. So no small task. Innovation is critical to stay fit in a crisis and to gather the strength to break out of it once we're through the worst of this crisis. And it also, very importantly, as we will see in this webcast, will help you to develop resilience and agility as the crisis evolves. So in today's webcast, we're going to bring together three very experienced innovation leaders to share their thoughts, their ideas on how you make choices in the short term that are informed by identifying and accelerating future opportunities. So we have, as you can see in this slide, divided today's discussion into three sections. And each of our panelists will make some introductory remarks and then begin to share some of their thoughts. But we'll also hear from you, as in each of those, we will also look at the questions that you are asking, and we will ask you as an audience for some poll questions, which we'll begin with right in a minute. So in the first section, we're going to focus a little bit on within business innovation. How is the crisis challenging your return on investment in innovation? How do you respond to those challenges that you have now? And how do you make sure that you reassess past investments and prioritize things for the future? And what does it mean for your innovation strategy? Is there a change in innovation strategy, and how do we deal with that? In the second section, we're going to talk about societal innovation. So this is the question, to what extent are we in a time that really big innovations, think about the Manhattan Project and Operation Warp Speed that is being talked about now, but also think about sustainability or innovation around aging populations. To what extent is this a time for these big innovations? What is the role of business, of government, of the research community? What are the pitfalls and the risks in starting these big innovations, and how can these various players interact with each other? And then finally, in the final section, we're going to talk about innovation culture. How do you drive a culture in the organization that even in those difficult times stays focused on innovating yourself through and innovating yourself out of the crisis? So lots of things to talk about. Great panel today. Let me start by introducing them. First of all, I'd like to introduce Rich Brenton. Rich is the former president and chief technology officer for Merck, which obviously is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. He has been in this role since June 2013 and very recently retired from that role, was responsible there for all aspects of the corporation's information technology and environment globally. Rich, it's great that you, just in your retirement, still freeing up your time to talk to us about your experiences.
Very happy to be here, Bart. Thank you.
And then we have Rolf Harms. Rolf is the General Manager Corporate Strategy, Cloud and AI at Microsoft. He's a member of our Conference Board Strategy Executives Council. Rolf has been with Microsoft for a long time, many years, has done a lot of work around the economics of cloud and on all sorts of digital transformation processes. And in recent months, he has also been leading a group within Microsoft on COVID-19 initiatives, where he has worked closely, for example, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One little interesting element is that Rolf and I have studied at the same university, the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, after which he also got an MBA from Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Rolf, it's great to have you on.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mike.
And then finally, we have my friend and colleague, Rita Shaw. Rita is the program director of several of our councils at the Conference Board, including our Product and Services Development Council, our Council for Innovation Leadership and Applied Innovation Council, and she is also a co-leader of our digital our Innovation and Digital Transformation Institute at the Conference Board. So I've worked with Rita for many years, and I know she's very experienced in sharing and very knowledgeable of all the ideas and thoughts that our members in the field of innovation have. Before Rita joined us at the Conference Board, she had a 30-year-long career at 3M, where she has been leading a lot of business development and product growth and has been active in a lot of innovation areas in 3M, and therefore a long experience. It's actually great to have three great companies being represented here on this on the webcast. Rita, great to have you on today.
It's great to be part of the 3 R's today.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, or the 3 N's, right? That's the other way to look at it. All right, very good. So let's go right away into our topics. And I thought we would start today with actually a real-time topic. So we have a poll question that my colleagues are going to bring up. And it's a question that we obviously read about every day. And that is the question, when will a vaccine become available? And our real optimists, our real pessimists, we'd like to see just, do a poll of all of you. An effective COVID-19 vaccine can be widely available, and by widely available, I mean it's at minimum going to serve elderly and vulnerable groups of the population around the world within 6 months, between 6 months and a year, between 1 and 3 years, or not within 3 years. So an effective COVID-19 vaccine will be available for, at minimum, the elderly and vulnerable groups in our population around the world within 6 months, between 6 months and 1 year, between 1 and 3 years, and not within 3 years. We'll give you a couple of seconds to think this through, and then I'm going to ask each of our panel members, I'm going to start with Rita here, to just give her thoughts on this. What are the things that you need to think about when you talk about such a big innovation as a vaccine, and what are the things that are going to take time? So give it 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Very good. Let's close the poll. So 56.8% of you, 79 of the respondents, are saying between 1 and 3 years. 45 of you believe that this can be done. 45% of you think this can be done between 6 months and 1 year. But very few of you think it could be within 6 months, and also very few think that it would take as long as 3 years or more. So, Rita, where do you find yourself? What are the things that you are thinking about when it comes about such a big innovation as the vaccine against COVID-19?
I'm sort of in the place that the majority have come out, and what my big concern is that we find that we engage people that aren't necessarily so involved in actually doing the vaccine in helping get the vaccine. So we get unusual questions that may lead to curiosity about some other areas and other industries that might have something we're not thinking of, because you can get so cemented into your own industry.
Yeah, right, exactly. Rich, what's your first comment on when you see these results?
I'm more of an optimist. I actually selected between 6 months and a year, although I think it's probably closer to a year. But what it's going to take is, and we're going to talk about this later, but essentially it takes a real strong partnership between the private sector, being biopharmaceutical companies, etc., the government itself, the public, and also a little bit of luck. To be quite honest, it's interesting that in the UK with the AstraZeneca Oxford effort, the concern is actually that the incidence of coronavirus is disappearing too fast. And if you don't have a prevalence amongst the population, you can't prove efficacy. So those are my initial thoughts, Bart.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Rolf, what's your first thoughts around this?
Well, my first thought is that this is not an area I'm an expert in, so I'll go with Rich's take. And that was sort of also, that sort of seems to be, I think, the broader consensus, 6 months to a year. I think what is interesting is that if you had done this poll in normal times, your whole scale would be off, because normally it takes, I believe, about 10 years to get to vaccines. And so I think that already kind of highlights how unusual of a time we're in, and also speaking of innovation, the kinds of steps people are taking to essentially break the normal model, which obviously is fascinating and important.
And I think you're absolutely right. Even between 1 and 3 years is unusually fast for a drug, but then the amount of capacity that we're actually able to bring to the table is probably going to be unprecedented compared to what we've been seeing in the past. But to Rich's comment, I agree. It obviously requires a lot of collaboration between different parties, and we'll talk about it particularly in the second section of today's webcast. And then Rita, I just was interested and thought it was very interesting to hear your comment. In this kind of discovery kind of path, there are all sorts of new discoveries down the road. So sometimes you end up at a place you didn't expect you would be in the first place. So lots of good comments to get ourselves going about what an interesting process innovation indeed is going to be. We're going to go right away into the first section, and we have a second poll question. So if our colleagues can put up the second poll question, we're going to focus on within business innovation first. So the first question that we want to ask you, many of you are in the business community, is an economic and business crisis the best time for business to get new innovations off the ground and go to the market quickly? So do you strongly agree with that statement? Do you somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree? So is an economic crisis or a business crisis the best time for business to get new innovations off the ground and to go to the market quickly? So we'll give you a couple more seconds to think about this. And then again, I'm going to ask each of the panel members just 30 seconds very quickly whether you're surprised or not about these responses. And then we'll proceed the discussion in a bit more detail, starting with Rolf. So we give it 5 more seconds to close this down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Closing it. Good. So 54%, just over half of you, somewhat agree with that statement. So there are ups and sides to innovating in a crisis. But still, 28.5% of you are saying strongly agree that this is a good time to really be innovating. Very few of you disagree with this statement. So there seems to be a real opportunity here that needs to be captured. And many of you on the call really believe that that opportunity clearly exists. Rich, let me start with you here first, 30 seconds response. Surprised about these results?
No, I'm not surprised by the results. Never waste a good crisis. It tends to light a fire under the population, particularly if you're working in support of a powerful mission. In the context of COVID-19, what's more powerful than human health itself?
Yeah. Rita?
Well, for me, I think it represents what we see with our council folks. The people who feel that they already have a pretty good culture will say strongly agree. And those that are trying to manage innovation more from a lower level will probably will somewhat agree, because they don't know if everything will wake up to really take advantage of it. I just didn't realize how lucky I was at 3M, who would keep going, even at the worst of times, with some of their bigger innovations.
Yeah, so I mean, it's good to see. I think there's sort of an optimism that speaks out of this, which I think is good to see. I would have probably expected a little bit more of a spread. But again, good to see. I mean, look, innovations, I mean, you can kind of say there's always a good time for innovation, right? It doesn't matter if you're in a recession or not. But I think it depends a little bit on what sort of an economist maybe think to say, but it depends, right? It depends on, whether the innovations are relevant to the time. Obviously, we just talked about vaccines. I mean, incredibly important innovation. So I think, and maybe we'll talk about it later, but I think the kinds of innovations that are important, that might change, right? So, what do you focus on during those times versus more normal times? I think that's probably where, we'll focus the discussion on.
And that's a great segue into actually where I want to ask you a little bit more about diving a little bit deeper into this, because I think at Microsoft, once you got into this crisis, and it's not the first crisis that any of these companies are hitting, you actually did immediately start to rethink your innovation portfolio. So can you take a little bit through the steps that you've been taking in how to think about innovation once you got into this crisis?
Yeah, sure, Bud. Happy to. We were saying, hey, this is an unprecedented time, and it obviously is. But I always think it's super interesting to look at sort of history, because there have been recessions before, maybe as severe as this. It's a long time ago, but you can always learn things from that. And so one of the things that we did is we said, let's go look at some of the prior recessions that we saw, and then for us particularly, we said, what happens to sort of technology innovation during those recessions? What do we typically see? And I think there's sort of two key insights, and one of them is sort of pretty straightforward, in that these recessions often tend to actually accelerate secular shifts that you're already seeing, right? I mean, I think we've been saying that we've seen more digital transformation in the last 2 months than in the last 2 years, right? It just really accelerates. So I think that's the first thing. So in some ways, the takeaway there is you need to make sure you're entering these sort of with a good portfolio that's aligned to secular shifts. But that's sort of obviously prior to the recession. And sort of then we said, okay, well, what do we see, though, in terms of changes? And so actually we used a framework from Geoffrey Moore. People may be familiar with that. It's sort of the pre-chasm, post-chasm, and aging. It's a very simple framework. And we kind of said, okay, what happens during technology that are in those different phases? And so if you kind of go through each of those, pre-chasm basically are technologies where you kind of have to squint a little bit to see the ROI. There's a lot of promise. There's potential for differentiation. But there's a fair amount of friction, right? Because you kind of have to figure it out. It's early. Then you've got the post-chasm, which is really about, what's more proven, friction's been taken out, fairly well established ROI, and then you've got sort of the aging category where kind of things are on the decline. Now, what happens when you go sort of where you're in good times versus when you're in a recessionary environment? So on the pre-chasm, again, during good times, people are willing to invest, they're willing to spend, they're willing to perhaps take a leap of faith a little more and focus on those things. In a recession, we typically see that people are a little more cautious there. They're saying, look, if the ROI is going to take me 2 years to get to, if there's a lot of friction, I may wait, right? I may want to be a little more careful there. Post-chasm, it sort of is the other way around, where in normal times they're perhaps more boring, they're not as interesting, and during recession environments, the ROI and the low friction is really important. I mean, we saw this, for example, in the financial crisis with virtualization technology, which basically allowed you to run more servers, in your data center, and so it's good ROI. Maybe not quite as sexy as some of the other technologies out there. Like AI during the financial crisis was actually, saw a bit of a slowdown if you look at VC investment, for example. And then finally, the aging technology, basically what you see there is that, that during good times, there's only reluctance to go push on it because you may have to do write-downs, you may have to, do some reorganizations. But during bad times, that's often a little easier to do, and so we kind of see that tend to decelerate faster, if you will. And so we kind of looked at that and we said, okay, so what do we take away from this? And then so we kind of formulated sort of a 3-step process. We said sort of step 1, let's go categorize our portfolio in those 3 stages. using revenue growth, usage growth, do initial categorization. Then let's go a little deeper. So step 2, we said, let's look at the ROI in an honest way. Let's look at the friction. How much friction do our customers have to go through? Let's look at, what's our differentiation? And finally, you always have to look at like recession-specific factors, right? So obviously, COVID will drive even some pre-chasm things very aggressively. I mean, obviously, some of the techniques we're now using to work remotely, those become much more important, regardless of all these other factors. And then finally, what we did is then we said, okay, which factors can we influence? Can we drive more ROI? Can we tweak things in the business model to get to ROI faster? Can we make our products easier to implement? So we kind of created a plan to say, okay, what actions can we take? And then you iterate, right? Then you learn, because obviously you're going to be wrong. You're going to see products take off that you thought were actually not going to take off, and then you have to sort of, iterate on that. So that's sort of a little bit how we've been approaching that.
One of the people in the question box made this comment: reasonable resources plus unreasonable pressure is time for prime innovation. When you think about your strategy, does that ring a bell with you? That saying?
Sorry, you said I didn't see the question here, but you're saying, oh, I see, there you go. Yeah, and I think it does create I think the saying goes, right, like that essentially, you drive creativity when people are in tough situations, and we definitely see that. We see a lot of folks, for example, inside the company that are now crossing organizational divides to solve problems. Some of the work we're doing around the COVID response, like many other companies, we realize the solution to problem lies into crossing these organizational boundaries. And so you see, I think, people's attitudes, because look, innovation is all about, it's about culture, it's about how people operate, how people collaborate. And I think what we've seen is that people's mindsets have changed very quickly, in quite an interesting way, actually. And so people drop beliefs. I mean, I was not a, camera on kind of video conference. I was sort of, let's go meet in person, and, and so that was very, very quickly. I had to change that belief completely. And so the ability to change beliefs, I think, is heightened during these crises. And so I think that makes things go faster.
Yeah. Which we now heard a couple of times on this call. I said it, you said it. Some people on the chat box said it. Every crisis creates an opportunity. And I remember when we had our prep call, we talked through a couple of crises that you've gone through at your time at Merck. At which times was the crisis an opportunity, and which times was the crisis actually a real nightmare?
Well, so that's a good question. Very often they're both, right, at the same time, both a nightmare and an opportunity. And the most recent crisis that we went through as a company was related to the NotPetya virus that was circulating in 2017. And those who are familiar with that will recall that there were a handful of companies, including Merck, that were very significantly impacted by that crisis. In fact, our entire business was completely shut down as a result of the infiltration of the NotPetya virus. And nearly 100% of our Windows-based infrastructure, whether it's client computing devices or back-end servers, were completely destroyed. And so that was a nightmare. The computing environment fabric for the company was rendered inoperable. And, the lesson there is that, to the point earlier, reasonable resources and unreasonable pressure create innovation is exactly what happened. The creativity, once you rally a group of smart people around a common goal, in this particular case, to bring the company back from the abyss, it's amazing what people can do collaboratively. And we were able to rebuild the company from scratch and get our legs back from underneath us. But what's interesting is you learn from that, and education of the executive board and the board of directors relative to cybersecurity happened almost instantly. And as a result, investment in infrastructure and cyber protection significantly increased. which turned out to be extremely fortuitous as it related to the coronavirus situation, particularly as it relates to the investments we made in remote access and collaborative technologies, et cetera. So, it's a long-winded answer, but I actually think it's both a nightmare and an opportunity very often at the same time.
Yeah. I want to ask both of you, because Rolf, you really sort of lay out these various steps, existing investments, current priorities, as well as new investments. But there must be a lot of conflicting interests here from different groups in the company, right? You invested massively in these innovations and you don't want a crisis to take you off course. Then there are these immediate needs that some people see that need to be fulfilled now in order to keep our customers. And then there are the big visionaries who say, wow, coming out of this crisis, we have a really new opportunity. How do you manage those conflicting interests in your company?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first of all, we also have to be careful not to overreact, right? Sort of, I think, again, it goes back to my earlier point of like, if you make sure that you invest for the secular shifts, again, what we see in many of these crises that it accelerates the secular shift. So in some ways, that helps you not having to make these very aggressive changes when a crisis does hit. But, of course, there will, even within that, there will still be adjustments you have to make. And so I think one thing that's super important and that we try to do is to be data-driven about it, right? Because I think people have, of course, these innovations can be something that somebody's worked on for a long time. And again, we may not say, don't do it. We may just say, hey, look, maybe this thing right now is more important than the other, so maybe we're sequencing them differently. And I think the way you do that is by bringing data to bear on it. Because I find that generally people are willing to re-examine some of these assumptions if they look at the data, if you're kind of saying, hey, look, here's what we're seeing last time, here's what the use, and again, the nice thing about the digitization that we're seeing is that you can actually look at usage data, right? So it's no longer a philosophical discussion, what might happen. You can sort of pencil in a plan, and then you can go look at, what's actually happening. What signal are you getting back, right? Many industries now get signal from their products, for example, that say, here's what's happening on the ground. And then you can sort of iterate on that. So that's sort of how we try to navigate that.
Rita.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to just ask a question of Rolf is, as we talk about this data helping, knowing what to do, what about those intangibles that we still don't collect very well on data? So what if a new strategy came out of all that work? That isn't necessarily captured, and yet it's an important ROI, but it's not captured. And so I just wonder if we've learned anything there since I was in the corporation, because that wasn't.
Yeah. No, I think it's really it's the collaboration of both aspects, right? There's sort of the intuition, the brainstorming, the vision, and then the data. I think that they will always be very important. I think we used to be that's the only thing we sort of have. We would think about a plan, and then much later we would see the results, and it was sort of like, well, it worked or it didn't work. I think that the interesting thing is what's happening more and more when sort of many parts of every industry become digital is that you can do that brainstorming, you can do that sort of like thinking through what might be the right way for people to start using your products. And then you actually go check much earlier whether there's traction. You go check on that signal, right? Whether it's a website, are people clicking on it? Are people using it? Are people signing up? Are people using my products? Are people downloading the app, all right? Are people rating it? And you can adjust essentially. You can sort of go back to the whiteboard, so to speak, and you can sort of adjust. Saying, what did we learn? We had some assumptions here. Well, it turned out that those weren't quite right, so let's revisit. So that you don't, basically, frankly, by the time you get to the did it work or not, you'll have a higher chance it did work, and you have ability to adjust along the way. So I really think it's both that sort of more intuitive and the data-driven approach together.
Rich, any comments from your side on how you manage these different interests? Big things we have been investing in, we don't want to let go, versus immediate needs versus big future visions?
Well, it's a matter of prioritization, and in my opinion, at least from a Merck perspective, we're crystal clear on those priorities that must be resourced in order to achieve our long-range operating plan. And any investments that correlate directly to the success of that plan are untouchable. Everything else is on the table, and those things ebb and flow depending upon what's happening as it relates to business dynamics. But it's really the prioritization exercise itself is really largely the same, crisis or no crisis. It's just a question of where you draw that line.
Yeah. Rita, we have to wrap up this section, but I want to hear some final comments from you, some thoughts that you have on prioritization or how you manage these conflicting interests in time of crisis.
What I'm hearing from the members basically is that they're talking with each other across functions more. So we have one company, for example, that's actually talking about risk management with the innovation people more deliberately so that they can balance these things. And so again, it's taking what we're observing and the trends and insights and more cross-functionally discussing them more regularly, and then thinking about the long and short term both at the same time. But that's earlier days yet.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think obviously innovators always need to connect to the rest of the organization, but this idea of so-called risk mitigation technology, right? So once you are in a crisis like that, having your innovation process partly focused on sort of trying to mitigate risk that you're facing as a company is one very important aspect of the immediate needs. So, good point. Okay, we need to move on, and we're gonna go to the next section, which is really on issues around societal innovation. As I mentioned earlier, in these times we try to think big, and some of you have mentioned that as well. And when you talk about the vaccine, or whether you talk about all the sustainability and climate change challenges we already had before COVID-19, or whether you think about the challenges of aging populations and what it means for our healthcare system, it's clear that these kind of big things cannot just be done by one company. They cannot be done by one university or one country. It really requires a lot of collaboration in so-called innovation ecosystems. And that discussion, of course, has come back recently. You've heard discussions about the Manhattan Project or Operation Warp Speed that the U.S. administration is talking about. Those are really kind of big challenges to do these kind of things. So I want to ask, again, first a poll question to all of you, and then I will ask Rich to really begin to think, help us a little bit, take us through what the challenges are for societal innovation. So let's open up the poll question. And the poll question is, COVID-19 is a statement. COVID-19 will lead to one or more major societal innovations aimed at improving public health and safety, and include global public and private partnerships to accelerate speed and maximize benefits. So you believe that COVID-19 is one of those opportunities that we really get big social innovations that will be focused on not just the vaccine, but improving public health and safety. And they will include globally public and private partnerships. Are you very confident that will happening? You're somewhat confident, you're somewhat dubious, or you're very dubious that that will happen at this point in time? Okay, and let's give it 5 seconds to wrap up. And that's now 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's close the poll. So this is a much more diverse and perhaps not surprisingly diverse response here. 42% of respondents are saying, I'm somewhat confident that that will happen, but only 32, just about 1/3 are saying that you're very confident. That's still pretty optimistic, a group. But also 20% of you are saying, I'm somewhat dubious, and some of you are saying, I'm very dubious about this. So, Rich, let's go straight into this, and later on I hope Rita and Rolf will also comment a little bit on this, and we can close the poll at this point. But let's talk a little bit through, if you think about these big societal innovations, what are the key drivers of that? What makes, can you think of examples that really made societal innovation really successful, and what are the lessons learned if we want to do that trick again?
Yeah, thank you, Bart. And as you mentioned, there's obviously many major issues that threaten our society, and very often, quite frankly, threaten our way of life. So whether it's climate change or access to affordable health care, and very often, these things, they threaten human health itself, whether to be debilitating diseases like cancer or the pandemic that we're going through right now with COVID-19. And the COVID-19 situation, this is not the first time we've been through a pandemic as a society. There's been the H1N1 situation, Ebola, SARS, and I was trying to think of a situation in the past that's loosely analogous to what we're going through now. And what I thought about was the situation with HIV/AIDS in the early 1990s. And if you all recall, if you were diagnosed with HIV at that time, it was a certain death sentence. So what happened, and what you saw was a significant mobilization of the public sector. You may recall an organization like ACT UP, which is actually still in existence today, that demanded investment in treatments, demanded access to appropriate health care, etc. The mobilization of research and development organizations supported by the government, and what happened? What happened was a very rapid development of therapeutics that have successfully shifted HIV from a certain death sentence to a manageable disease. In fact, Merck was the first company that came out with a product called Crixivan that actually helped to shift that paradigm. And as an example of how what you can do when you work together, in that particular case, typically it takes 10 months to a year to get a new drug through the approval process. However, in this particular case, that particular product, Crixivan, was approved in 42 days, which doesn't happen unless you have a very tight partnership with the government, the regulatory agencies, and the research and development companies. So what seems clear is that success in this space is rooted in a high degree of collaboration across governments, the public, the private sector, philanthropic organizations, and the public. And if you look at what's happening with COVID-19, or if I look at what's happening in COVID-19, examples of that are actually playing out in real time. You can see what happened when you unleash the private sector to develop improved diagnostics, whether it's testing for coronavirus itself with the Abbott 15-minute test, the 100% accurate antibody test that Roche was recently approved for, significantly expanding testing capacity through partnerships with Quest and LabCorp, companies like General Motors re-engineering their manufacturing sites to increase ventilator capacity, philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation committing $125 million to help with the equitable distribution of PPE. And right now, over 100 plus vaccine candidates in development. And a good example of the partnership is AstraZeneca partnering with Oxford University, supported by $1.2 billion from the U.S. government to support that particular vaccine research. And Merck itself just announced yesterday the acquisition of a vaccine company and the development of 2 vaccines and a therapeutic. And of course, the public gets involved because you can't conduct clinical trials without the brave patients that are willing to risk their health to actually go through these things. So, it's interesting to kind of watch this societal innovation, in my opinion, play out right in front of our eyes right now, which just demonstrates the power of partnership and collaboration when you have a significant mission. But, there's no guarantee of success. I know I'm running over, and the only thing I'll say is the trick in this particular case is not to overpromise and underdeliver. Which I worry about when it relates to something like vaccine development, etc. So I'll pause.
Yeah, because when I hear you answer, there's a lot of moving parts here, and a lot of things need to get right. I mean, Rolf, you and I are both economists, and we know that one of the things in innovation is externalities. What we call is that everybody plays their role, business, government, and the research community. If everybody does what they need to do, there can be huge gains for society as a whole that go far beyond what each individual player would do. However, a lot can go wrong. Science can be captured by commercial interests or political interest even. Governments can cut corners by, not waiting for the scientific proof of new inventions. Businesses cannot optimally assess their private versus their public benefits. So a lot can go wrong in these kind of innovation systems. So can you share a little bit about what your experience is? How can we make sure that a path where there's so many moving parts that it is going right and that we're avoiding all these pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's kind of interesting because, if I look at Microsoft's transformation and sort of journey, frankly, one of the things that the things we were struggling with is that we had different parts of the company, say a decade ago or more, that clearly all have different parts of the puzzle, if you will, different pieces of the puzzle, and it was hard for us to get them to, work together more effectively. And so one of the things we talked a lot about was this sort of concept of local maxima and global maxima, right? So we were doing a lot of local optimization where maybe this is the right thing for this business, this is the right thing for that business. And I think in many times with sort of breakthrough innovation, what you really need is you need to bring together all these puzzle pieces from you can only complete the puzzle if you bring all those pieces together. And so we started thinking a lot about sort of global maxima across the company. And so that's a lot of the journey that I think Microsoft has gone through in the last, a decade or so. Now, in some ways, I kind of see a lot of patterns recognition sort of in broad society, right? Where you clearly see the way to solve some of these challenges, whether it's COVID-19, so the pandemic, vaccines, or even just other things like sustainability. The only way you're going to solve it is by having, again, these different stakeholders do a global maxima, not everybody optimizing for their own, but really putting all the pieces together. And it's a hard thing. But I am an optimist, so I'm like, okay, so this is clearly now laying bare some gaps we have in areas like healthcare. And so, what I think we saw after 9/11, for example, that the way security was handled changed permanently. And so I think that that's going to happen the same way here. People are going to look at this and going to say, well, we really have to make some changes in terms of how do we make sure we get the data, right? Real-time data is really important. How do we make sure we get that? How do we make sure we can respond more quickly, that we're more agile? And I think it's going to require both, as Richard said, private collaborations. It's going to require private-public collaborations. It's going to require international collaborations. I mean, I think one of the things that's been fascinating, and I'm a little more, we've done some work around sort of the economic recovery side, a little close to home for an economist, but and there we spent a lot of time at the Gates Foundation, we spent a lot of time at the World Bank, and conversations that frankly we never really had before. So I think that crisis does make people step outside their normal comfort zone and say, okay, what does it take? Okay, let's go talk, let's go work together.
Yeah, I think actually there was a remark in the chat box that I found interesting, because when we did the poll, we said, whether people were dubious about whether this could be done in COVID-19, and the response was, well, dubious is not only about the doubt that it will happen, but also the doubt whether there will be a real intent of changes that will be pushed in the name of safety and health. So the function, the purpose of the innovation also has to be clear and agreed between different parties. And I think that's another real challenge that it's very difficult. If I think at the times now, it just seems that sometimes different parties have different objective functions, and therefore go for different results. Rita, anything that you share from either your experience at 3M or what you hear from your council members when it comes to their involvement in these sort of big innovation attempts?
Well, it's actually not directly answering your question, but it's kind of harmonizing some of what I've heard, is the global versus local maxima. I believe things like Salesforce, this is public information too, how they try to work on the community in San Francisco, how they try to address inequality in pay internally. They thought it was gone, and then they had data that showed that it wasn't, and they started developing something new. I think it'll be a hybrid of some of these local Maxima things to address the bigger ones. So in addition to the ones that Rolf and Richard talk about that are really addressing these big things, there are going to be shifts in the companies trying to address social innovations that really impact them. They're going to be doing experiments that will feed those bigger efforts. And I just want to say that's the sort of thing I watch our council members being more involved with, is that more local by company or industry cooperation that I think will feed these bigger, tougher issues and may even give us some of the solutions.
Yeah.
So I feel optimistic.
This is another interesting question. I wonder if one of you want to take that one up, because I think it's a good question. Interested in thoughts if this crisis will enable us to remove inefficiencies and extra steps that seem to pop up with other crises. So lessons learned from the past about what things we could do better. On the HIV/AIDS example, Rich, that you just gave, there was an earlier comment. It's just a comment above there that's saying, the issue there was that the problem really started to occur in the 80s, and it took well into the 90s before we really had, a more effective solution to it. So what are lessons learned from that? And again, it gets to the issue of speed, right, which Rolf was mentioning earlier. Rich, any thoughts?
Struggling. I think speed is often a function of the intensity of the crisis itself. And while I agree with the comment that it started to incubate in the 80s, and it took a number of years for, in that particular example, the comment is the government to get its act together. That crisis started slower than the crisis that we're dealing with now, which was almost generally instantaneous. So you would expect the reaction to be much quicker and the inefficiencies to be knocked away at a faster pace. And you hope that those inefficiencies that were truly inefficiencies that you pushed your way through will become you'll deal with them in a positive way systemically going forward based upon lessons learned versus having them be reintroduced. But that is all a function of the reflective times that we'll go through post the actual crisis itself.
And Bart, I'd like to just build on that. We're seeing in the healthcare members industries how they're taking care of really vulnerable people, that they would have to have 3 different kinds of expertise deal with them. And because the healthcare people had to be redeployed, they even changed who could do it to maybe 1 or 2 instead of 3 people, and then they collected data and saw the outcomes were the same. So the time frame Richard mentioned was a huge factor in keeping out those inefficiencies.
Yeah.
If I'm
Good.
interpreting that.
Good. Well, there's a lot to talk about. We're running out of time, so we're going to go through our last section, which is really about innovation and culture. I mean, you can talk about what needs to be done. The question is, are we ready? Are we set up? Do we have the culture to do it? And for that, we have a final poll question. It's a little bit more complicated because it's multiple choice. You can pick different answers. The question really is, what are the most important aspects of an innovation culture? And you can pick up to 3. So you don't have to pick 1. Pick the 3 that you think are most important in terms of the most important aspects of a strong innovation culture. And I'll give you a little bit more time. Obviously, it's a somewhat longer list. And then I will ask Rita to sort of reflect a little bit on that and what she's learned from her own practice as well as our members' practices in this respect. So pick the 3 things that you think are absolutely critical to a strong innovation culture, in particular, of course, also in these times of crisis when culture is such an important thing for companies. We'll give it 5 more seconds for people to pick their 3 most favorite. Of course, what you're going to see is that the percentages are going to add up to more than 100 if you can pick more than 3, obviously. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll close it. Okay, there is actually interesting stuff in here. It's of course multiple options picked. Again, it adds up to more than 100%, but you can see that half of you, at least half of you, picked the one: innovation, committed, and authentic leadership. So leadership is something that's really standing out for many of you as being absolutely critical. And then there are a few relatively close. One is strong internal collaboration across the organization, empowerment of team. So that's the two that you're seeing there as being very important. That's closely followed by the ability to fail fast and team diversity. And also, by the way, linking innovation to business goals and strategy. So Rita, let me start with you. When you look at this list, when you look at the prioritization that people are saying, with that strong emphasis on authentic leadership and innovation committed leadership, and then followed by teamwork and collaborating across team and empowering teams, is that what we're hearing across the board when we talk to innovators?
Absolutely. In fact, the top one there is really interesting. We're seeing with our council members, and I think we're hearing it today, that so many of the leaders are moving from being the heroes and the people who have to be the answer givers to the ones that are more generative in terms of getting more people involved in asking better questions, being okay with being challenged, and engaging what the other folks are saying is highly diverse people collaboratively inside and outside the company, so that it's reflecting what we saw even before the pandemic, that now that the barriers for people who didn't say it was convincing are going down, and I think they want to. But I think at a higher level, what I really think is important is the story that if you take any of your experiences on what your risks are for a project to succeed. I remember one that I did at 3M. We had 15 high risk factors. 3 of them were technical, all the rest were people. And we know, or people or systems or something, we know this when it's going right. And so it's really helping the leaders know how to engage people better. And so we're seeing skills in how do you ask better questions? How do you look at things as not just a problem to solve or a job to be done, but also often a polarity to manage? Because many times you're trying to get the best of 2 sides of good things. And we're seeing that happen too as sort of a framework. And then really what that brings that back to innovation. Those of us who've been practicing that for a long time, we're so open to other people's ideas and we build on them. We don't try to sell our idea right from the front, that that's the best idea. And then we collect data on it, on experiments that we're working, and we modify and we pivot. So it's a different combination is my answer for any company of what's going to work best for their industry. But those that are the highest there to me are the really key ones that will be probably common to all of them.
Rich, here's this comment also here, interested in thoughts about organizational culture's role in enabling or hindering sustainment of innovation momentum that may be established during times of crisis. So what of these traits are really important in times of crisis when you want to keep focused on innovation?
I think it's the point earlier that for me it's all about leadership and sponsorship and leadership. I often used to say, I led a group of. I built a new technology center in Prague, the Czech Republic, and 80% of the employees were millennials. And I used to often say to that group that my biggest strength as a leader is my 35 plus years experience, and my biggest weakness as a leader is my 35 plus years experience. And I call that, I say I'm blinded by my experience. I can't see a better way because I know too much. And so leadership that can recognize when they're in the way and get out of the way, I think is extremely important.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and Rolf, you're in the middle of it right now, and suddenly entering this big crisis and having to think about how do we keep the innovation pipeline active. You talked about before how you're strategizing about it. What are the cultural traits that you think are been really important in the company that sort of are making a difference to be successful?
Yeah, I mean, I thought, Bart, that this sort of poll was a trick question because, I look at all these things and I'm like, God, you need all of these. I can't think of anything that's not critical. And so that was sort of my cop-out answer, which, you're not allowing it to. But so my framework is sort of like the top-down, bottoms-up, right? So I think clearly the innovation community and leadership came up very high, and I absolutely agree that it's super important, because if senior management does not embrace innovation, encourage it, cheer it on, then you're not going to get a lot of bottoms-up innovation. But a lot of innovation has to come from bottoms up, though, right? It's not like I mandate you go innovate. It doesn't work that way. And so then how do you get more bottoms up innovation? I think then that's where sort of diversity in all its forms becomes super important. I mean, there's sort of three, there's team diversity, sort of inside your team. There's the ability to strong collaborations across the organization, sort of organizational diversity. And then there's even, bridging to other organizations, right? Because other organizations may have pieces of the puzzle. So I think those are sort of the things that I was thinking about. I do want to make a plea for one of them in particular, though, and I also saw this question about, what is lasting and what is not lasting in terms of change. Culture of curiosity and fast learning, I think, are just super important, particularly in a crisis, right? It kind of goes back again. You could do the same thing where you're saying, okay, of all these things, which one is even more important in a crisis? And I think it's that one. Because what happens in a crisis is that suddenly, everybody talks about the new normal, everything changes, right? So all these assumptions you held about reality, they're kind of going out of the window. And so what you really need then is you need curiosity. You need to sort of be curious about, okay, what is this new normal? How is it going to look like? How should I act differently? What assumptions, what biases should I let go? And how should I sort of rethink things? And then fast learning. I think that becomes even more important in a crisis. And having that trait as individuals, as teams, as organizations, will allow you to essentially make sure you retain some of these things as well, that you don't go back to the normal and then you're like, okay, whatever we did before, forget about it. Because there's a lot of good things that happen too, right? A lot of boundaries are being crossed that we should try to retain even after the crisis is over.
Yeah, I was interested actually to see that clear objectives and tracking didn't get that many votes. Again, Rolf, you're totally right. You want to pick everything. But I think I've heard some of you say earlier on how important it is that we measure very well, that we track the success of our innovations as well, and that we need to have those systems in place and really adhere to them even in times of crisis. So that was the thing that I want to add and say that I was actually, given all the work we're doing on that at the conference board, also making sure that we track innovation, measure innovation properly, I think is going to be very important here as well. Look, there's a lot more to talk about, but I always save a fun question an interesting question for the end, and sometimes we don't get to it. But when we did our prep, some of you said, actually, I really want to answer this fun question that I had, so I'm going to use the last 2 minutes for that purpose. And that question to each of you is, what would be your dream innovation after COVID-19? It could be related to COVID, but it could be related to something else. There's a real opportunity here now to do something that we weren't able to do. And I'd like to ask each of you very quickly, you only have 2 minutes left, to say what are you hoping that really will come out of this crisis as a new innovation? And Rita, you were particularly keen to have the ability to answer this question, so I'm going to start with you.
Well, it was because I had come up with an existing one, which was about how the restaurants are getting everybody involved in stuff, in creating experiences, and then they're co-creating things. But after this conversation, my dream is related to really Charles Popper and Rolf's conversation. Charles asked, how do we get data about the future of how people will react? And how we do that is still totally not done. So that would be my dream.
Rich, when I was looking you up at YouTube, you actually presented a video somewhere that was about dream innovations that young people had. So I know that you're into this topic too. What is your dream innovation?
My dream innovation is a broad recognition that some of the petty politics of the past are not really that relevant going forward. So to the degree that there's some decrease in politicization issues would be my dream innovation.
Yeah, right. Well, okay, I'm not going to comment on that. It would be a dream innovation. I agree. Rolf, can you get beyond that?
No, I did +1 on that. Well, I mean, maybe I'll say this one. So, when I interview folks on my team, I again trying to look for that culture of curiosity and fast learning. So I often ask the question, you know, I grew up in a different country. I grew up in Holland like you, Bart, and I live in the States. I go back and forth a lot. So one of the things I always ask is like, you know, what would happen if the world had a teletransporter where you could instantly transport to every country and every place? You know, it would be great. What would happen, right? And so you kind of think through how the world would change. That's the kind of intervention I would love to see. Now, the interesting thing is, I kind of feel like that's sort of what's happening now, right? The way we're getting used to meeting remotely, how we're making these remote meetings ever more like real meetings, how we're introducing features, you know, raise your hand and things like that. So in some ways, I could say I had to start this innovation that maybe was not possible at all, teletransportation. And then in some ways, I'm now seeing that what we're doing, for example, with remote work and teleconferencing is actually getting in the direction. So maybe a little more of a realistic wish that I've substituted it with.
Great. Well, a lot of things covered in this hour. Thank you, Rita Shaw, Rich Brenton, and Rolf Harms for all you valuable comments. Lots of good discussion in the chat box as well, so much appreciated. There is a little webcast evaluation, and of course we'll be back again in a month's time, and we'll again, of course, then going to talk a little bit more about COVID-19. We're going to go back to the issue of fiscal policy, so we're being a little bit more again in the economic area. And what is the optimal fiscal policy in this crisis? What are different countries doing in this space? So please, if you haven't registered, sign up for it. You'll get emails around it. And thank you for your participation, for all your comments, and we all hope to see you again soon on one of the conference board webcasts. My name is Bart Verark, Chief Economist at the Conference Board.